Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank the Conservatives for bringing this debate on housing to Parliament today. I think much of the debate already has and may continue to be highly political in nature. I, for example, could join others in criticising the Tories for their decades in power and their presiding over at least one housing bubble and crash, or for their role in welfare cuts and the impact that's having, particularly on young people. Or I could cite Labour's record in government, Gordon Brown in his first budget in 1997 promising that he would not let house prices get out of control, but when he left office a decade later they'd tripled. Or I could cite Nicola Sturgeon and the targets she set a decade ago which have not been realised. So let me say at the outset that my constituents, particularly the generation of young people being frozen out of affordable housing, are looking for ideas and practical solutions. These exist in the realms of planning and housing policy. Books and academic papers have been written about them. I've invited academics and architects into Parliament to talk about them. Reviews such as the Land Reform Review Group recommended a number of them, and we had a few in our manifesto last year. So, at risk to my own political career, I want to congratulate Ruth Davidson for her recent speech. We don't agree with some of the ideas in it or some of the assumptions that lie behind it, which we do want to explore further. Ruth Davidson highlighted a number of issues in her speech, many of which, in fact, are Scottish Green Party policy. She was right, for example, to draw attention to the scale of private renting, not through the choice of the tenants, but through lack of real choice in the housing market. She was right to draw attention to swathes of existing housing falling into serious disrepair. She was right to note we need to take on vested interests. And she was right to advocate direct government intervention to procure land. And she's right, above all, to admit that the big question is the question of land, and that we should be considering repealing legislation that ended the ability of local authorities to acquire land at existing use value. So I and my party commit to continuing the conversations that we've been having with her MSPs and with MSPs from other parties to use the next 4 years to design and enact a far better system of housing and planning than the broken system we have now. Presiding Officer, the current housing system is broken. We need a new approach to new build, to building maintenance, to accelerating energy efficiency, to creating more nuanced use classes for domestic property, for example, to tackle the scourge of short-term lets, to reform housing taxation and to tackle homelessness. Happy to take an intervention.
Elaine Smith.
Mr Whiteman for taking the intervention, but I wonder, like the other intervention that I made earlier, he doesn't seem to have mentioned affordable public rented housing. Is that part of the Green approach?
Andy Whiteman.
It is indeed, and I'll be saying something about that in a minute. Greens advocate the following measures, for example. We advocate a target to eliminate the speculative volume house building industry within 10 years. Unlike the Tories, we think this model is redundant. It's time for a new model, one which reflects well-established practices in much of Europe, including, as Ruth Davidson noted, in Germany and the Netherlands. And this new model will be based on public-led development with high-quality community-based planning, putting consumers in control of procurement, including housing associations, restoring the professional role of planners and architects, and boost the skills, opportunities and talents of the SME building sector. We advocate a new approach to land acquisition, based on restoring the right for local authorities to acquire land at existing use value. We advocate a new approach to housing taxation by abolishing the council tax, a tax described by the Scottish Government's own economic adviser, Sir James Mirrlees, as indefensibly regressive. We also support the abolition of land and buildings transaction tax, another tax which Sir James Mirrlees argues there is no sound case for retaining. We want to see a radically different approach to housing care, repair and refurbishment, with logbooks, sinking funds and mandatory energy efficiency measures at point of sale in the private sector, because over 80% of Scotland's existing homes will still be in use in 2050, and only with serious action to improve the quality and energy efficiency of existing homes can we ensure that everyone in Scotland has a comfortable, warm and affordable home to live in. Above all, reflecting Elaine Smith's point, we advocate a substantially expanded programme of genuinely affordable housing, using cooperatives, councils, housing associations and others to provide genuine affordable homes to all who wish them, not simply those meeting defined income criteria. Now, along with most other parties here, we are committed to end the stigma of homelessness. But past solutions are clearly not working, and the work of the Local Government Communities Committee in its forthcoming inquiry and the indications in the programme of government reassure me that that stance is agreed. Particularly, schemes such as Housing First we are very encouraged by and believe should be extended to support services to individuals who face a variety of very challenging circumstances in their personal lives. Presiding Officer, we are in a strange position where the previous Housing Minister, Margaret Burgess, stated in January 2016 that the government expected the private housing market to operate wherever it can without government intervention. Whilst just over a week ago, the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party was arguing for direct government intervention to procure land. As it happens, I see some signs that this government is sympathetic to this as well. But if this is the case, it needs to be much more explicit and demonstrate a greater urgency in coming forward with ideas. As I indicated in my opening remarks, we stand ready to work with all parties in the Chamber to pursue radical new measures through planning, land acquisition, fiscal and other policies to deliver a very different housing future for the people of Scotland. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been a good debate this afternoon. I think 1 year exactly on from the last very short government debate we had on the 13th of September last year, and I hope it's not we won't just have these debates on an annual basis, because I think many of the points that members have raised are far too important for that. And despite the understandable political ding-dongs and critiques, which I am happy to engage in at any time, but perhaps not in very valuable chamber time when we're looking for solutions, I think there is a lot of agreement. As I indicated at the outset, we want radical change, and we are convinced that that's possible within the powers of this Parliament. And I'm also encouraged from what members have said that I think some of that radical change could, with the political will, command a majority in this chamber. And some of what divides us, I think, may be assumptions about how we should go forward, and certainly perhaps priorities as well, priorities for housing. James Dorman explained that the failure of the 2007 target set by Nicola Sturgeon was due to the financial crash. Monica Lennon indicated that she, in her professional capacity, had been a victim of that. But the aftermath of that crash was a consequence of the financialisation of housing. It wasn't a response to any fundamental failure in our ability to actually acquire land and build houses. It was entirely due to the financialisation of housing. And we have the powers to ensure that the consequences are overcome, principally by tackling the key component of that financialisation, which is the land question. And so, in particular, let me reiterate and recognise that the speculative volume house building industry is itself, due to its financial model, part of the problem, and our priority should be to eliminate that industry within a decade. Now, I regret that that analysis is not more widely shared, but I am happy to speak to members about some of the assumptions underpinning it. It was well illustrated, in fact, by George Osborne, who I seem to remember was a Chancellor some years ago, when he went to Dublin in 2006 and gave a speech in Trinity College, where he claimed that Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible in long-term economic policy making. Well, soon after, of course, the Irish economy crashed and burned on the back of €420 billion of debt secured on a mountain of land and property speculation. So, as I said at the outset, I agree with Ruth Davidson. We should be looking to countries like Germany and like the Netherlands, countries where, as she correctly said, 60 or 70% of housing is self-built. It is self-procured. Customers are in control. The SME sector is much more powerful. Competition by house builders is not for land, it's between companies who want to build you the best possible house that's as energy efficient as possible and will last as long as possible. Those are not the competitive pressures currently in place in the volume house building industry. In addition, municipalities in countries like Germany and the Netherlands can have, and they have the legal power, and they've had it since reconstruction after the Second World War, and we had those same powers as well before they were abolished in the 50s. They have the power to acquire land at existing use value, well below, to a factor of 20 or 100 or so, the cost of land with planning permission, to service those plots, to master plan them and to sell them on. And as a consequence, they have higher quality homes with lower costs of energy that last far, far longer than the design life of most new build property in the United Kingdom. And I was reading recently, for example, of something that's entirely normal in the German experience. A group of women in their 50s, whose families had left home, who got together and built a new tenement block in the heart of Berlin. That is entirely unexceptional. That kind of project is undertaken with the assistance of the local council and within an ecosystem of highly professional, technically skilled and innovative builders and designers. Now, Labour's Elaine Smith rightly pointed out that housing is a human right. We agree. And Pauline McNeill said that it should be part of the national infrastructure priorities. We agree with that. And one point I have frequently made in relation to care and repair of properties and refurbishment and energy efficiency is that in places like Edinburgh, the tenements, in fact, are not, strictly speaking, private property. They may be that in law, but they are actually, in fact, part of the public infrastructure of the city. They've been there for longer than some of the streets and some of the other public infrastructure. The private interest occurs as a consequence of the fact that people occupy them for short, temporary periods of time. And yet it's incredibly difficult still to get the appropriate maintenance and upgrade that we need to common property. Alex Cole-Hamilton mentions affordability, and we think this is a priority for government to redefine what's meant by affordability. Just yesterday, the UK government's house price index showed a 4.8% increase in house prices in Scotland, the only part of the UK where house price inflation is growing, and in the private rented sector, a two-bedroom flat in Edinburgh, £950 a month, 6% increase on last year, 32% increase in the last 5 years. We also agree with Maurice Gold that the Warm Homes Bill provides an incredible opportunity, and we welcome discussions around mandatory interventions in the private owned market to upgrade properties at the point of sale. Miles Briggs made some good points about health. Jenny Gilruth regaled us with the wonders of the new towns, much of which I agree with. I don't have time to tell the story about my favourite author, Ian McHarg, and his bid to develop Scotland's third new town. Greens have exciting ideas, and in the forthcoming planning bill we want to implement some of them. I want to thank all members for their contributions, commend our motion and look forward to further discussions.